Good afternoon, everybody. Wonderful to see you all, and welcome to the second series, the second lecture in a series of lectures we're running jointly sponsored by the Cross Oxford Future of Food programme and the Environmental Change Institute Food programme. The overall topic is how food systems operate at different spatial resolutions, different spatial levels. And last week, those of you who are here would have heard Ellen give a talk about Sweden as a nation, and some of the ways that national policy is set and how that affects local and other aspects of the food system. Today we have a talk from Mike Hamm, who I'll introduce in a moment, which will be looking at subnational. And tomorrow, next week, Monday, and the week after that, we'll have two further talks which will conclude the series. Next week we'll be looking at the notion of major capital cities and how their food systems work. And then the fourth in the talk will be here itself. So, Mike, let me just introduce Mike. Mike Hamm is a visiting research fellow at Mansfield College in association with the food group here at ECI. Come to work with me. I should say my name's John Ingram. Forgive me, I forgot to introduce myself. And Mike and I have known each other for several years, and we have a shared interest in how food systems work, particularly at this spatial resolution. Mike, as you see, is Professor of Sustainable Agriculture in Michigan State. He's here for a 6-month fellowship. We're a couple of months in, and my goodness, the time's flying.
Yeah, it is.
Mike has been kind enough to contribute to an elective we run, and some of you who are doing that would have met him there, and also has been beginning to have conversations across the university. So do be aware, Mike's around for another 4 months or so. And I'd just like to say welcome, thank you very much for being part of this seminar series, and over to you, Mike.
Thank you. Thanks,
We look forward to what you have to say.
I will judge that at the end.
So we look forward to it.
Thanks. So mine won't be quite as provocative as the talk that my wife and I went to late last week over at St. Cross College that was on the topic of cursing. And the last, I think it was, maybe it was in philosophy, I'm not exactly sure what the topic area was for the seminar series that she did. But at the end of it, her final slide is, are there any effing questions? I will not do that at the end of this talk. It was an interesting talk. Never heard that at a university before. So at any rate, so I want to talk about the value of regional food systems in a globalized world. And what I want to do is take kind of a very practical approach to this. And I want to remind us that a food system is about a lot of things. It's not just about production. Certainly production is an incredibly important part of it. Where is it? Growing and producing, there we go. Growing and producing is a very important part of it, but it's only the starting point for the food system, because we also have to, for those of us who live in cities, the food has to get to us. For those of us who live in climatically challenged areas, like my home state of Michigan, we have to do something in the off-season. So we have to process, we have to move it around. People have to store it for periods of time. It has to get to us. We have to prepare it and eat it. And there's all kinds of inputs that go into that food system. Everything from the inputs that farmers put in their fields to packaging to the processing inputs and things like that. And there's waste at all different points that has to be dealt with. And we deal with that in various ways. And so we're going to talk, to some extent, talk about all of this very briefly today. And I want to start with a premise. And the premise is that change happens. And there's a corollary to that. The corollary is that we can't predict exactly what that change is going to look like. Certainly today we like to look at climate change scenarios, but we have to look at climate change scenarios and water scenarios of what's going to happen with fresh water. And all of these, the further out we get, the further the lines of demarcation of what the upper and lower boundaries of that are. And it's probable that we'll be somewhere inside those boundary conditions. It is possible we'll be even outside those boundary conditions. So anyway, we don't know exactly what it's going to look like. And we can always assume that we get better and better at predicting the past, because we're typically using the past as a predictor for the future to a large degree. And so what that means is, the way that I try to think about this and kind of our food in the future and how to develop sustainable food supplies and resilient food supplies is that since we don't know exactly what's going to happen, we can predict some kind of boundary conditions. We're better off maintaining as many options for the future as we can at any given point in time. And so I'll talk about that a little bit more. And so then what I focus on is this notion of a regionalized food system. And by regionalized, I mean that it's a food system in which we kind of optimize what we can do within a local area, within a region close to where we live or at some distance from where we live. But we're not exclusively doing food from that point. We're maintaining connections and having supply chains and production areas in further regions, in a national scale and in a global scale. So I think of it as a food system that optimizes the production and consumption and supply chain infrastructure within a defined region, while integrating with larger regions as well as the national and global food supply in a manner that provides healthy, sustainably produced diet to all of a region's inhabitants. And then the question becomes, well, what is a region? A question I get asked all the time. And 10, 15 years ago, there was a number of people in the States and elsewhere that did surveys of people of what do you think of when you think of local? And for as many different people as there are, there's almost that many definitions of what local means to them. And for me, to a geographer, a region is anything that's subcontinent, that's less than a continent in size. I think of it a little bit smaller spatially than that, but for us it still is, in the work we do at the center at Michigan State, it's a nested concept. So in Michigan we have this area here, Detroit's right about there, and think of that circle as encompassing about 10 counties among the 83 counties that make up Michigan, and in those 10 counties is about 52% of the 10 million people that live in Michigan. So most of the population is concentrated in that area. A larger region outside of that would be the geopolitical region of Michigan, which is basically the lower peninsula here and the upper peninsula up there. So that's one region. And then we have a larger region, which is the Great Lakes watershed. And that Great Lakes watershed encompasses several states and several provinces of Canada. And so we can think of that as three regions that are nested inside each other. And so that's one way and that's kind of the way that we operationalize the notion of a regional food system in the center. And so, again, to kind of put it simply, for us, a regionalized food system is a rebalancing in the developed world, like the United States or like the EU and the United Kingdom. It's a dynamic blend of regional direct sourced and indirect sourced, national and global, all fitting together to create a food system. And so, in the developed world, the way I think about it is rebalancing. So, in the early part of the 20th century, up until about World War II, in the United States at least, we had a fairly regionalized food system. A lot of our food came from fairly local areas. But then as transportation improved, as post-harvest management and refrigeration improved, and with post-World War II, with the large availability of nitrate fertilizers and phosphates and other things, we started to basically deconstruct a lot of those local supplies and regional supplies of food and rely more and more on concentrated production areas and the processing and transportation and infrastructure that goes along with that. And now, so in my neck of the woods, in my part of the world, it's about rebalancing it, bringing back that regional and building up the supply chains and the infrastructure for that regional supply and interfacing it with the national and the global. And so why do this? Well, to a large extent, my perception of it is it's to hedge our bets. Because again, we don't know exactly what's going to happen down the road. And so it makes sense from a resilience standpoint and from a sustainability standpoint to maintain as many different types of supply chains, as many different types of production points, and maximizing kind of where our food is coming from as opposed to relying on one place, which I'll talk about a bit in the United States case, which is California. And so, and from my standpoint then, what that does, what we have the capacity to do is to improve the resilience of the food system, to improve the capacity for food security now and moving down the road. And I think it's real important to keep track of the fact that resilience doesn't mean that we keep the ability to do exactly the same thing. What it does mean is that we maintain the ability to keep our same core function and our same core purpose. So the best example, and one that I used this morning in the class that John has, the seminar that John has, is to think about pasture-based animal agriculture today. When I talk to some of the animal producers in Michigan, when you talk about pasture-based production, they say, oh, you want to go back to the way things were in the 30s or the 40s. And the answer to that is no, because we know a lot more now about intensively managed rotational grazing, about mob grazing, about maximizing diversity in the constructed pastures, so we've got a good mix of legumes and grasses and composites, while at the same time increasing the efficiency of the animal production so that you're minimizing the amount of food that has to go in to produce whatever ruminant meat that it is you're trying to produce. And so it's not about doing things the same, but it is about maintaining the same core function, that is, producing animals on a landscape in a way that kind of keeps a perennial cover on that land. So it's about the capacity of the system to absorb disturbance and reorganize so as to retain essentially the same function, structure, and feedbacks, to have the same identity, the ability to cope with shocks and keep functioning in much the same kind of way. And the way that we've looked in our center at regional food systems is exactly this. As in this rebalancing process, we basically increase the capacity of the food system to absorb the shocks and disturbances that we have on a regular basis, and we'll have more in the future. And what that means to us is not that we can exactly define when we have a resilient food system, we'll know it when we see it. And in fact, I would argue that as we develop the capacity of different parts of the food system to reduce its greenhouse gas exposure, to reduce fresh water use, to internalize the nutrients that are required for the production of the food, etc., we will then learn more about how to do that, and we will improve the situation even more. So in many ways, developing greater resilience and greater sustainability is about a process of continuous improvement. It's not about getting to some endpoint. My favorite story is when I first went to Michigan State, Jim Bing and a colleague of mine and I did a series of focus groups with farmers across Michigan. And one of the questions we asked all of them was, what does sustainability mean to you? And the one answer from a sugar beet farmer in the Thumb region of Michigan was, I think, one of the better ones, where he said, to me, sustainability is about doing it better than my father did. I farm with less inputs, with less pesticides, with less fertilizer, and I produce more sugar beet per acre than my dad did. And when my son takes over the farm from me, he will probably do it better than me. And so this notion of continuous improvement, I think, is an important one. But one of the things I think that we can say is that there's characteristics that we would look for. And are we moving along in adopting those characteristics and incorporating those into the food system to become more resilient and more sustainable? And so I would argue, and we could talk about in great depth, and I'm just going to run through them, and if they spark some questions, feel free to ask later. But diversity of scale, diversity of the systems, diversity of production points, of production strategy, of the background of the people engaged in it, are all critical. Minimizing the external input so that it's more of a cycle and less of a throughput of materials. Enhancing the natural resource base and minimizing externality development, things like greenhouse gas, externalization of pollution and other kinds of things. So those are characteristics, I think, that are embedded in a resilient food system. And so the challenge, as I see it, in different parts of the world are several-fold. One, in the developed world, largely, it's about redeveloping the production, supply chains, policy, and cultural norms to enable the development of these regionalized food systems. In much of the developing world, this past summer I don't have a lot of experience in the developing world. I've done that consciously over my career. I'm starting to engage in a bit now. And in the beginning of the summer, I started doing some work with a colleague in Malawi. And after seeing that and talking with other people, I'm becoming pretty convinced that in much of the developing world, the challenge is to ensure that the existing regionalized food systems are not destroyed in the march to supermarket modernization, which is what some people would like to see. In fact, there are strong arguments against doing that in many parts of the world. There's some evidence out there in South Africa, for example, that cities that have moved to a largely supermarket-based food distribution system have decreased the food security for those in the lowest half of the economic strata. In some parts of the world where this modernization towards supermarkets and all the kind of large supply chains that implies has moved along recently, it's not losing the regional basis that can coexist with that. Now, why? Well, one quick thing, and this again is another long conversation, but one of the things that I think has typically not been talked about enough, that we need to start thinking about much more, is a lot of the nutrient inputs that we put into our agricultural systems. Now, nitrogen, if we want to put enough energy into doing it, we can keep making nitrate. The nitrogen gas that's in the atmosphere is pretty inexhaustible, so we can keep doing that. The phosphorus that we put into our agricultural system is exclusively mined for the most part. Outside of what we recycle, through the recycling of manures of various types and food waste and things like that, the vast bulk of the phosphorus that goes into our agricultural system globally today is mined. And the best estimate is that we will hit peak phosphorus somewhere between 2030 and 2040. and that the phosphorus that unless we start mining the seabed, the seafloor, the phosphorus that we have left in the mines that we know about right now will run out by the end of this century. And it is absolutely true that we cannot substitute anything else for phosphorus. We don't exist without phosphorus. And so one of the things I think, and part of the value of, especially as urbanization proceeds apace across the globe and we move towards a world that is 70% urbanized, the notion of moving nutrients from city areas back into rural areas where most of the food is going to be produced becomes more important. And having these regionalized food systems begins to construct a scenario in which we can think about cycling the nutrients from city to farm and farm to city in a self-referential loop. And so this is the one watershed scenario I've been able to see for thinking about recycling of phosphorus from both kind of reducing the waste and the leakage in the system and recycling human waste is from the Twin Cities, Minneapolis, St. Paul in Minnesota in the U.S. And what they looked at was that with kind of adding in multiplying scenarios about reducing phosphate available for export, reusing phosphate available for export to agriculture, reusing urban phosphate, etc. Anyway, what am I trying to say? What I'm trying to say is that what they found is that the phosphate that is embedded in the urban areas when food comes in, and what typically does not go back out, it gets stored in septic systems, it gets stored in landfills, etc., could produce about 47% of the food supply for the population of the Twin Cities. So in other words, you can have a real cycle of nutrients if you start thinking in this kind of a way. There are people here in NGOs across Europe and across the world that are thinking about city regions now and city region food systems, and how do we think about improving the resilience and sustainability of these city region food systems. So I'll let that go. Now the question is, why can't more of it be gotten? Why only 47%? That's because large amounts of phosphorus are lost in the system, especially at the point of production, where the most significant loss is from erosion of soil. The phosphorus is bound tightly to the soil through the phytates, typically in phosphorus. It gets bound to the soil, and when the soil is washed down the Mississippi River or washed down the Thames or wherever, it's washed into the sea, and it's gone. Okay. Therefore, I would argue that we need to redesign and evolve, although quickly, systems that can maintain flexibility while maximizing the recycling of nutrients and carbon in our human-managed food system. What do we need? What needs to be present in a region to do this? Well, you need land, you need human capital, you need people who know how to farm, people who know how to take food through the various parts of the process to get it to our mouths. You need technical expertise and research. I think it's very clear that research in all parts of the food system has been important to increase productivity, to increase the capacity to post-harvest manage things so that we don't lose them, etc. You need infrastructure, including markets, financial capital so that people can borrow money to get things going when it's needed, and a policy climate to facilitate this with a touch of preferencing, perhaps. Now, in the United States, for example, geographers and urban planners are talking about these mega regions evolving. And so one of the interesting things to think about is how you would create kind of mega region, regionalized food systems. And the Great Lakes fits into that larger region that I talked about earlier. Okay. Now, in each of these regions, there's going to be limitations. When I say optimize, I say that word specifically not to talk about that we should get most of our food or 30% of our food or 40% of our food or whatever it might be. Because the amount that could come from that region in a larger network is going to vary depending on where you are. This place right here, the Northeast, if you look there, there's a very, very large population from Washington, D.C. up to Boston and north of there. There's a lot of people along that corridor. And there's relatively small, little amounts of farmland relative to the population. Their ability to, say, provide the food supply there is probably more limited than it is in the Great Lakes region, because the Great Lakes has a lot of the Great Plains and large amounts of very good farmland. To give you an example, oops, I pressed the wrong button, sorry. There it is. New Jersey, which is where? Right there, where I was for 20 years before I went to Michigan. New Jersey has about 10 million people in its population. Michigan has about 10 million. New Jersey has about 900,000 acres of farmland left. Michigan has about 12 million. There's a difference. So, What I think it's important to do then is several things. Increase the ability to respond to extreme events. I went to a conference in Japan last February that was organized by the Japanese Academy of Sciences about responding to extreme events. And it was specifically around the tsunami that took out the nuclear plants in a number of villages. And so one of the things I think is the ability to respond to extreme events means having multiple sources and supply chains. Improve the potential for food security and livelihood development. Improve the ability to create relatively closed loops of NPK and maintain a better global balance of water and carbon. So there are a number of prime issues. The first one, I think, is who will farm and where will they farm? Who will develop the businesses needed to create new supply chains from the farm gate to the consumer? To what extent can consumers be moved towards a path of greater consciousness? Let me talk first a little bit about who will farm and where will they farm. I think there's probably some of these similar types of issues around the world. Again, in the developing world, the challenge may be that as people flow from the rural areas to the urban areas, there's going to be a greater ratio of people in urban to people in rural. And so what's going to happen there is, relative to the rural farmers, are they going to be able to sustainably intensify their production? Are they going to have the tools and materials, the appropriate technology to allow them to do that and maybe reduce the hand labor? In a place like Michigan or in the United States in general, where we have a very small farming population relative to the population who don't farm and want to eat, and the population is aging who farms. So who will do it? Well, this is work from Steve Miller in our Ag Econ department and Susan Cocciarelli in our center, kind of looking at what's going to be happening to farmland over the next 20 or 30 years in Michigan. And one of the things that's true is, and so this says basically they surveyed farmers that were 55 and over and said, what are you going to do with your farm when you retire, and do you have plans for it? And what it says is basically that 52% of it's going to be turned over to successors. And those successors are typically their kids, and their kids typically don't plan to farm. And in fact, the expectation is that there's about 500,000 acres of land in Michigan out of the 11, 12 million acres of farmland that'll change hands in the next 10 years through retirements. What's going to happen to that land? Is it going to get consolidated into larger and larger corn and soybean farms, or what? And so the question becomes then, who will farm? And I will say that in the United States, at least, we have a very poor national policy, to the extent that it virtually doesn't exist, of thinking consciously about how do we think about farming over the 21st century. Well, we've kind of conceptualized, so who's going to become the farmers of tomorrow? Who is becoming the farmers of tomorrow? And there's really three main groups. The first are those that I'll call generationals. That is, they grew up on a farm in the U.S. They typically, in the U.S., they go off to one of the land-grant universities, Michigan State, if you stay in Michigan. They get a degree in horticulture or in crop science or in ag business, something like that, and they go back to the farm and work into taking over for it. There's also a number of places, like this is a high school Springport, where the FFA program is helping kids develop ideas for kind of new age agriculture. The second group is immigrants. In Michigan, the fastest growing group of farmers are Hispanic. They are people who typically were migrant farm workers who have settled in the States and are now starting to get their own piece of land and become independent farmers. There's a group in Michigan called MIFS that's working with a group of Hispanics that have a co-op called Farmers on the Move. And I'll talk a bit more about that in a few minutes. But the point of this is that at least in Michigan, we have, in the United States, we have large numbers of immigrants who come from farm backgrounds in their home country. They're either refugees or they're migrant farm workers who have settled into the country, and if given the right opportunities, could create a vibrant base of new farmers for the United States. But there's a lot of issues there. I'll get to that in just a second. Then there's what I call new generation farmers. These are people that are either second career or first career. A lot of young people coming out of college or coming out of high school that usually from an environmental standpoint are interested in agricultural production. There's been a lot of the land grants at Rutgers. When I was there in 1994, we started a student organic farm, and every year about 10 college students went through the farm and helped produce 3 acres of vegetable crops, and in 10 years we never had one that grew up on a farm. These are all kind of new generation farmers. A lot of second career people. A friend of mine, well, I haven't seen him in quite a long while, but anyway, a friend of mine in New Jersey, Jim Kinsel, was a certified public accountant. In his first career, when he was about 30, he decided he wanted to be a farmer. His first year, he netted $2,000 on the farm. That's not that much, right? Fast forward 15 years with a lot of study on his part, a lot of learning, and he's grossing $750,000 a year on it as a community-supported agriculture farm. So there's both of those. And all of that, all three of those, I would argue, are really critical to developing the next generation of who's going to, and the next generations of who's going to grow food for those of us who don't farm. Now, the challenge, of course, is I think, for both immigrants and new generation farmers, is they didn't grow up on land, or they may have in their home country in the case of immigrants, but they don't have it now. So they don't have access to land, which means in the United States at least, they don't have that land as collateral to get bank loans to start a farming operation. So they don't have land. B, they don't have credit access oftentimes. A study that Susan Cacciarelli did looking at beginning farmers on the western side of the state, out of 14 of them, about 10 of them financed their farm with their credit card. That's very expensive credit, as expensive as it gets. So access to credit is a real issue. In the case of immigrants, oftentimes, if they're used to producing in their home country, they're producing for a different kind of market, a different kind of customer. So they have to learn what kind of markets how do they produce for these markets? How do they sell to these markets? So there's a lot of issues for these two groups to become active farmers and develop skills over time. And so we've kind of operationalized, and we just started a grant from USDA, from the Beginning Farmer and Rancher Grant Program, to develop a networks across the state of Michigan to develop some of these things. But so there's training needs, there's business development needs, there's land access needs, there's capital access needs, there's market development, and there's continuing information. Just a couple quick things that are happening in some of these areas. The land one's kind of interesting, and try to think about what are creative ways to start to create land access in ways that are affordable and usable. So MSU, Michigan State, is in the midst of a capital campaign, $1.2 billion or something like that. And because there's a lot of farmers that have graduated from MSU, many of whom are getting older, MSU gets regular offers of donations of land, oftentimes hundreds of acres. And they say no to most of them because it's a management issue for them, and they don't need the land. And so we've started having conversations with them and with the land management office and with the director of our research station about, as part of the capital campaign, taking that land, and then we make that land available to new farmers who are going through the Beginning Farmer and Rancher program that we're developing, and give them short-term leases to start with, 5 or 6 years, to see if they get through that stage of a small business being successful, with then an opportunity to purchase that land over time after that, because MSU doesn't want to own it in the long run. So we're working on some things like that to think about how can we create land access. Another one of the people that's involved in the grant is going to start working both on crowdsourcing strategies and on traditional lending strategies to look at different ways for farmers to access credit to get things going. So there's things that we can do there. The challenge, of course, to this in small and local in the U.S. is that there's a lot of people that we work with in the food movement world that are all about it's got to be small and local or it's not really going to work. And I always like to examine assumptions of things we need to do. So there's just a little thing for you. So in the 2012 census, there was about 194,000 farms across the United States that indicated that they sold some type of produce in the previous year. Okay, some type, 194,000. If all the produce in the United States for the population in 2020 were grown on 2-acre farms, we'd need 23 million farms in the United States growing produce, or a 100-fold increase over what we have right now. So that's not going to happen. If those all became successful and they got appropriate mechanization and scaled up appropriately, even 20-acre farms each would be 2.3 million farms, where we right now have 194,000. The point of that is we need this diversity of scale of farms that are large and small and medium size and all kinds of things to actually deliver a healthy diet to everybody. Go there. Okay, so food system starts with production. We can produce many things. There's some things we can't. For example, in Michigan, we don't produce hard red winter wheat. We produce soft red winter wheat, which is pastry wheat. Across Kansas, north and south of Kansas, they produce good hard red winter wheat. We don't produce beer barley, much to my chagrin. About every 3 or 4 years we can produce a good crop, so we need to get that from Canada or other good places. We don't produce bananas. And we are seasonally challenged. So the question is, can we move some things indoors? And the question is, can we move some things indoors in any kind of a sustainable way? So to give you an example, well, let's just take kale. That's an easy one. So kale, green is outdoors. So we can grow kale outdoors from about the middle of June. We can get it until sometime in the end of October. But with unheated high tunnels, we can actually produce it 12 months a year. And with tomatoes, for example, we can produce tomatoes outdoors. We can plant them about May 15th, and they're going to get frosted out about October 1st. With unheated high tunnels, we can start getting tomatoes about May 15th, and we can get tomatoes until about November 15th. So I'll talk more about that in just a second. So that's our seasonal challenge in Michigan, is that we have a pretty short growing season, and right now there's about a foot of snow on the ground. But these structures are ones that have been researched quite a bit at MSU by a horticulture professor, John Birnbaum, in our hort department. So this is about what it looks like right now outdoors in Michigan. And this is about what it looks like inside these high tunnels. There's no fossil fuel energy that's heating these things. There's 2 layers of plastic here, and there's a little fan that blows a layer of air between the 2 layers. You can think of double glazed windows and kind of the extra R value of that extra glazing. And then in the wintertime, you put an extra layer over the inside. So you basically got 3 layers over those crops in the coldest part of the year. But you can produce about 30 crops all year between indoors and outdoors with these structures. Most greens, a lot of the Asian greens, and a lot of lettuce greens and different kinds of greens like that, and a lot of the root crops except for potatoes. And so the question, though, is doing that. So let's say, for the sake of argument right now, that we may argue that a seasonal diet would be the best thing to do, but the public's not going that direction right now. They want to get a lot of things a lot of times of the year. So let's ask the question. In January, where does most of our lettuce greens in Michigan come from? It comes from California. So would it be more environmentally sustainable to get it out of California or to get it from these things? So Rachel Plowecki, who was an undergrad working with me, did a life cycle analysis to look at the carbon footprint of getting lettuce out of those hoop houses in the wintertime versus getting it from California. And what she found was the embedded energy, the embedded carbon footprint in a head of lettuce is about 1/5 getting it out of that hoop house versus getting it from California. And that's accounting for the amortization of the lifetime of the steel and the plastic and everything else that's in those things. So in fact, if we're not going to have a completely seasonal diet, we would be better off from a greenhouse gas emission standpoint at least, getting it out of those hoop houses than getting it out of California. Okay. If we move to indoor systems with light and heat to produce things, fruiting crops like tomatoes, I think that it goes the other direction. And I don't know, I just don't eat tomatoes in January because they taste terrible anyway. If you go to completely indoor systems, I don't know what the story would be because I haven't seen the analysis. Now, what to do in context of a regional food system? First, you got to create the context for movement. So we've asked ourselves the question, what are all the things that need to be in place to think about moving an agenda for a regional food system forward? And the way that we've done this is to say, first, you need a context for movement so that people and entities from a variety of backgrounds and interests can see a value in participating. Second, you've got to create the framework for an infrastructure to support this. Third, you've got to create a climate of professions emerging within this sphere. Fourth, create a groundswell of support. And fifth, ensure robust analysis so there's continuous improvement in the development. The first of these in Michigan we did in 2010 by catalyzing the development of the Michigan Good Food Charter, which is a set of 6 goals for 2020 for the state of Michigan. And we did this in a process over 10 months that involved about 600 people across the state. We have the basics of Michigan in the 21st century, having a thriving economy, equity, and sustainability. In the interest of time, I won't go through this in any more detail, but where is it? MichiganFood.org has all kinds of things on it, if you're interested in seeing more. Then the question is, how do you create the framework for an infrastructure? Well, in that case, then what you really need is you need all these networks of different entities that are working on different parts of it, and all of them networked in a series of networks. So, for example, There is a network that has evolved, where's that? The Michigan Good Food Fund, which is evolving now, which is going to be a fairly large scale. It's looking to become a $30 million loan fund for ensuring access to healthy food by low-income populations in the state. And that right now has about $5 million in it, and it's being administered by a community development financial institution. You need a there's a network at work across the state that includes the private sector, the public sector, animal sciences in Michigan State, people in our center, that's looking at regional livestock production. There's a network that started out as 3 networks, one working on K through 12 school lunches and school meals and getting local agricultural products there, one working with the hospital system where there's about 140 hospitals across the state, and one that was working on colleges and universities. Those have merged to create a farm-to-institution network. So there's a number of these different networks, and then these are being networked through 2 venues. One is, in essence, a Michigan Food Policy Council out of a subcommittee of the Department of Agriculture at the state level, and one through the steering group for the Michigan Good Food Charter. Then you need to create a climate of professions emerging. So, talked about institutional foods a little bit. K through 12. We have 680 school districts across the state of Michigan. Those are all independent school districts. Almost every school in the state provides school lunch. Most of those schools get some federal aid. If a kid comes from a family that's below a certain level of income, they get a free lunch and the federal government reimburses the school for that lunch. If they're a little bit higher, they get a reduced rate for the school lunch and the feds reimburse for some. If they're higher still, they pay full rate. In 2004, we surveyed all the school districts with our Department of Education, which is where school lunch is managed. We surveyed all these food service directors and found out that about 10% of them said that in the last year they had gotten something from a Michigan farmer. And there's a lot of details for that. In 2012, when they were resurveyed in the 3rd survey that we did, and by that time, about 54% of the school food service directors had purchased local foods from farmers or through their distributors. So that's a massive increase over that 8 to 10 year period. And so there's a cohort now of food service directors that are thinking very consciously about how do I fit in purchasing regionally in the framework of my lunch program. Acute care hospitals, 117 of the 143 have committed to sourcing 20% of their food by 2020. So that's a massive movement in our healthcare. The other side is farmers. Are farmers interested in these markets? So in surveying farmers, what we found was that if all the vegetable farmers who hadn't already sold to institutions, about 50% were interested in selling to at least one. So one of the things that we've done, and Colleen Matz at the center is the farm institution specialist and takes care of all this, is she's developed a whole set of materials, including videos, for food service directors to help them identify the things that they need to do to work with local farmers, and some materials for farmers to help them identify the things they have to do to work with food service directors, because they find that they talk different languages. What kind of boxes they use, the sizing, how they frame their sizing is all different. The second thing is to get these foods into larger markets. Restaurant chains, in some cases the food service directors, like Michigan State, which has 49,000 students on one campus, so there's a lot of food that goes through there, is the creation of new entities that are focused on aggregating product from these regional producers and getting it into larger volumes so they can get out to people who need it. And thus is the development of the terminology of food hub. In 2013, we did the first National Food Hub Survey in collaboration with Wallace Center and USDA, and we defined food hubs as food hubs are or intended to be financially viable entities that demonstrate a significant commitment to place through aggregation and marketing of regional food. What that survey showed, the important thing with setting the data aside for a second, but the really important thing was that survey showed in self-reported data of 105 food hubs across the country that you need a gross income of about $600,000 a year to be a viable business, to cover all your base costs and generate be able to pay all your stuff without outside funds coming in. So one of the things that we do, and Rich Pirog runs this with funding from a couple of foundations, is we, in collaboration with the Department of Ag, have a food hub network across the state that has quarterly meetings with about 70 people, and there's 10 consultants around the state that are charged with working with the food hubs to develop business plans, develop marketing plans, and things like that. Basically, there's a lot of technical expertise in play to help develop new cohorts of professionals to build these kinds of businesses so that food can get into different various avenues. The next thing to do is to create a groundswell of support. Well, farmers market is one way to start to show an indication of support. When I went to Michigan in 2003, and this has nothing to do with me, it's just that's how I can demarcate my time. In 2003, the best estimate people had was that there were 90 farmers markets in Michigan in a population of 10 million. Fast forward to 2014, and the estimate is that there's 380 farmers markets in the state. So you go from 90 to 380 from 2003 to 2014. That's a massive jump. And what that means is that there's a lot, and there are more communities interested in having them. The reality right now is that there's a shortage of farmers to sell at those kind of farmers at farmers markets. But that doesn't ensure that everybody in the community has access, because historically, when food stamps, which is the low-income food support program in the United States, it's now called SNAP. But when food stamps went from paper food stamps to basically a credit card that gets charged every month, farmers markets across the country lost the ability to take food stamps. Because at that point, when it first happened in the late 90s, there was not the technological infrastructure for wireless communication and all that stuff to be able to have wireless readers. Okay? Fast forward, and in 2006, there were actually 3 farmers markets in the state of Michigan that could accept food stamps or SNAP benefits. And I think the total amount they took in was about 14,000. If you fast forward through a lot of public effort through the Michigan Farmers Market Association, which was founded in about 2009, and Drew Montroy is the director, work by the Michigan Department of Agriculture and the Department of Human Services coming together. In 2012, there was 103 farmers markets taking SNAP, and in 2014, the number was up to about 130. So we grow tremendously in terms of the ability of a larger swath of the population having access, but there's still opportunity to increase that. If we look at what that has meant to sales and income for farmers and access by people of various means, what we see is that in 2007 there was virtually zero, I think that number is $14,000, of food stamps were used at farmers markets. Fast forward to 2012, that number is $1.5 million. In 2014, it was about $1.8 million, a massive increase. Part of the reason for that is because we have a program run by the Fair Food Network in Michigan called the Double Up Bucks program. They get philanthropic dollars and use those philanthropic dollars with grants to the farmers markets to double the value of the SNAP or food stamp benefits for the customer. So when somebody comes in and uses their SNAP card, and they buy $20 of produce, they're only charged $10 on their SNAP card, and the farmer gets reimbursed the other $10 from the grant that the market manager has. So it extends it makes these things more accessible to people with low income. That's about a $5 million a year program in Michigan at this point. I should say that program, because of that program in Michigan and in Connecticut and about a half a dozen other states, the latest farm bill put $60 million into it per year of that Double Up Bucks program being expanded nationally with federal dollars. The other thing that we try to do is to think about how can we take that kind of a concept of making food more accessible for low-income populations so that everybody has access, and at the same time expand the ability of farmers to get access to technology that will expand their markets. So we developed this Hoop Houses for Health program that's run by the Michigan Farmers Market Association. And basically what it does is it gives farmers a grant, farmers who sell at farmers markets that accept SNAP benefits. It gives them a grant to put up a hoop house, say $14,000. They pay that back in produce to people with tokens. So Head Start is a program for preschool kids. It's basically a preschool program for kids from low-income families. The way this works is that the market manager or the Farmers Market Association gives tokens to the Head Start programs in the area around a farmer's market. The Head Start program gives those tokens to the parents when they pick up their kids. The parents go to the farmer's market and they can get produce for nothing by turning in these tokens. and then the farmer pays back that $14,000 loan over a 5-year period, not in cash, but in product. I'm going to skip this one in the interest of time. This one, another idea is in Detroit. Jess Daniels, who's this person right here, a grad student of mine at Michigan State who took a leave of absence to get this program off the ground and is now coming back, thank goodness, to do her dissertation, started a program in Detroit called Food Lab, which is a network of about 60 to 90 food entrepreneurs starting small food businesses that are trying to figure out how to manage a triple bottom line, how to both be profitable and do social good. And so this is a really good example of the development of new cohorts of professionals that are both trying to access regional food, do it in a way which builds a profitable business for themselves, and gives something back to the community. And the final thing is to ensure robust analysis to continuous improvement. In this case, we've started a collective impact project with a consultant out of Oklahoma to basically look at what types of measurements to look at indicators of success do different nonprofits, different programs, different entities across the state want to use, and come together to develop a shared set of data collection tools that everybody will use so that we can develop a general picture of how we're doing and how we can improve. And so in general, what we've seen so far is that there's overall willingness to share results and to aggregate data and do all that. The capacity to collect the data is limited, and so we have to figure out how to do that in a simple way. I'm almost done, I promise. So for food system sustainability and resiliency, then what I think is needed is to optimize the local, regional, but be connected to national global supply chains, consciously build diversity across the multiple dimensions, create partnerships that build social capital and trust, with special reference to those with least resources in the community to build equity and inclusion so that everybody has access not just to the food but the ability to develop a livelihood for themselves. Take demographic profile into account. Are there sufficient people to farm, or is there technology to make them efficient? It's an issue that I didn't really touch on much today. Can we maximize the recycling of nutrients and minimize the carbon and water footprints, and develop appropriate technology so that as people start to scale up, they see a pathway to doing that with appropriate technology that can be sustainably driven that allows them to be more efficient. And with that, I'll quit and I'll just indicate this is my grandma. And she turned 107 in January. She was 105 there, and she was 90-something there. She still likes her beer. People always ask her, what's her secret to long life? And she says, well, I have a 6-pack of beer a week, 1 a day, none on Sunday. And so with that, I'll quit. There's wine back there, not beer, but that's okay.
Good.
Okay.
Thanks very much,
Thank you.
Mike. That's really good.